the hockey, yeah.
Yeah, that was my favorite one. No, I'm just kidding. All right.
They all got into Stolar and Dolar.
I'll open up with a prayer real quick. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time. Come together and to learn the things that you'd have us learn in this class. And thank you for watching over us to get us through the end of the semester. And we hope that all the students across the land are actually doing very well. And we ask for peace and comfort in those last couple of weeks as everybody goes through their final examinations. And we love you and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So this one, what do you guys think of the case study? As far as, I mean, there's not a ton of questions in here, but what do you guys think overall as far as the negotiation and all that kind of stuff? Any initial thoughts?
I thought it was a perfect example of why unions are a bad idea.
Yeah, sometimes they can stronghold, and they're not agreeing on anything, and it's a really frustrating thing because I've actually had to go through and negotiate a couple of union contracts, and sometimes the stuff that they're asking for isn't realistic. Specifically when we talk about pay and or benefits that there a lot of times the union may be asking for or may not be asking for. I guess this one's a little bit different because they're players. But bottom line is NHL is a business, and they can't just pay players with no money, especially if they have no investors. And so sometimes it can hinder the negotiations, especially when they're asking for money.
Right. Well, and it seems like one of the things that the players missed, when you get drafted by a team and you sign a contract with a professional sports franchise, you are a piece of property. They own you. And so, when they were talking about how they wanted control over their image and everything like that. And I was surprised that the league gave that to them. But they make money off of those cards and posters and stuff like that. That's part of where these guys' salaries come from. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they wanted full control over their marketing rights.
Right.
Anyhow.
I know it gets a little out of whack there. What do you think the root cause of the problem was that was identified in the case? Like the main problem.
What do you think, Sydney?
I'm looking at it. I'm sorry. These cases just keep getting duller and duller. But I honestly think that the two head guys that were negotiating, I thought it was interesting because it said in the case that some of the players weren't really into what the union was saying, and that the union was trying to have this strong front, and some of the players were coming out and saying, we just want to play, like we don't really care about these things. So I really feel like it's just the leaders of the union, I don't remember their names, and the NHL that were going at each other that were the main ones that had the issue. Like they both wanted to be the ones that won, I feel like, instead of trying to come up with a compromise. They're like, we want to win our side, when really everyone else was like, we don't really, just have a compromise. We don't care anymore because it's just taken so long to try and figure out what would work for both of them. Like they just weren't willing to compromise, I feel like.
Right.
What do you think the culture is of the NHL as far as compromising? It doesn't seem like they have. I mean, they want to compromise a little bit, but money's money.
Well, and I think sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
One of the things I noticed when you look at these players, when you look at the demographics of where they're from, they're all from socialist countries, and so a union is just second nature to them. That's how they get stuff done. And so anyhow, I know as I was going through that train of thought, it sounded real political, but it was one of those things where it was just that's their way of life is forming an organization and then using it to strong arm whoever to get their way. And so it's interesting because the unions don't ever, they see how much money's coming in and they say, oh, well, we want some of that. And if you ask them how much of it do you want, they say more.
Yeah.
And so it's they don't take into account that someone's got to keep the lights on and keep the ice frozen and pay for the uniforms and the plane rides. They don't ever take into account what it costs to do something. And we see that in unions nowadays, you know, where it's the auto union and things like that. They just see the end result. Oh, you sold this car for $30,000. Well, we want a big chunk of that, as opposed to, well, how do you keep the lights on in the plant?
Mhm.
And so I think part of the culture here is kind of tainted by that. They call it a collective bargaining agreement, but there's no collective bargaining. This is what we want.
Right. You got anything, Sydney?
Not really.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry.
I feel you. So there's two questions, one right after the other. What are the best ways to strengthen BATNA? And BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And is it possible to change another person's ZOPA? Why or why not? And that's zone of possible agreement. So it's really those questions are talking about. What are some of the things that you can do during negotiation as far as being the alternative to whatever the negotiated agreement is? And how do you change somebody's agreement or thought process, you know, during ZOPA, which is zone of possible agreement? I think for me, when I look at and have negotiated these things in the past, a lot of times there are certain things that you can't compromise on. I mean, they're just flat out, there's no compromise on, because some of the things are just ludicrous. They're just not even feasible. So when you look at trying to get to that alternative, there's always a give and take. And sometimes unions feel like you're taking too much or you're not giving enough, and you're not giving back. So it really comes, in my opinion, if you have only 2 or 3 things on the table, it makes it tougher to negotiate. But if you bring in 5, you bring in 6, you bring in 7, it's like, okay, you want that one thing, but you got to give me 5, or vice versa. You know, you want to have, the more you have to negotiate, the better you are as far as the tools that you have. Because if you don't have anything to negotiate and they're asking for something, you can't have any, you know, cannon fodder back to them. It makes it really difficult to negotiate. And that's kind of what I've gone through in some of my experiences. But just having a bunch of alternatives helps that, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. That makes I liked also what you said about that there are some things that you just that are not negotiable, and you know, and that doesn't just include some of the goofy stuff that they're asking for. There are just certain things that you, as the, you know, whether it's the league or the owners of the company or whatever it is, you have to, you got to have ice if you're going to play hockey. That costs a certain amount of money. And so I think one of the things that I've never negotiated with unions, but I've negotiated, you know, contracts and stuff like that with other people. And I did kind of the same thing that you mentioned. I broke everything down into percentages, and then basically went back to them and said, you know, this is what this all makes up. You pick which of these things you don't want. And generally they come back and go, well, we need all of those things. And you go, well, okay, then, you know, this is what it costs to do all of those things. And so I think as far as changing their zone or changing their channel and getting them to think about other things, if you can get them to understand what the bare bones costs are of things, then it limits significantly the amount of actual monies or work that has to be done or whatever the contract is about or the negotiation is about. It limits it. You knock it right away. You knock it down to maybe there's only 25% that's negotiable.
Yep.
So I agree with both of you. I was thinking along the lines of the fact that they only brought two things to the table and neither of them explained like why. I felt like there wasn't any explanation. Like the NHL didn't give any explanation why they couldn't do something. They were just like, we're not going to do it. So I felt like that kind of shut everyone else off because like it shut both parties off to the idea of an alternative. Like they didn't bring up an alternative. They kind of just got into that idea of we have to have what we want, So they needed more options. Like you said, I think that they needed a couple more things that could have fit in with the compromise better because they only were focusing on those two things. But I felt like there could have been other things brought in onto the table that could have made each of them happier,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true.
I never negotiated before.
You negotiate you're married. You negotiate all the time. You just don't call it that.
Yeah, but I feel like that doesn't count.
I call that fighting. No. All right. Next question. We already answered that one. And the last one. All right. So what would you do if you were the National Hockey League players? How would you work to resolve a situation? And do you think your position or your idea would work, and why?
So how would the players solve it?
Yeah, what would you do if you were one of the National Hockey League players? Like, how would you work to resolve the situation?
Well, I feel like I'd be really upset at the union because they're not trying to compromise, and the NHL gave them kind of an ultimatum and said, okay, it's this or the highway, And so I think that I would get the people, like get players together and go against the union and tell them we need to take this deal or something, because if they don't, isn't it like it shuts down or something like that, or something bad happens?
Yeah, they'll do a lockout, which is
they lock them out.
They basically said, well, since we can't agree, then we're just not going to play, and then that starts affecting all the businesses, local businesses, the bars, all the stuff that's in those surrounding areas. Then that ends up causing problems. So it's not just a player issue; it's really a community at that point issue. So I think for me, if I was part of it, I would think back and try to rally the players to say, what's important here? And granted, we make a good salary for what we do, and we could get hurt. Maybe that's one of the concerns that they have, is they get hurt, and then once they get hurt, they don't get that paycheck. But what are they really doing there? They're there to play hockey. They're there to play a sport that they love. And I don't know, for me, it's just like, try to rally the troops there and say, let's focus on playing hockey. Not so much, if we can get them to give a little bit more, then we should be okay with that. But, we shouldn't stretch the league so far, because we don't know the particulars of what the league is paying paying for. Bob, as you mentioned, like keeping the lights on and the ice cold and everything else, that advertising and everything else that gets people to come to the games, So.
Right. I like what both of you said. I like the point that Sydney made about the fact that they just said no. They didn't really have any reason why. And the league did that, and the players union did that as well. And so I think I would go with what you talked about there, Jeff, as far as kind of rallying everybody together and go in there with specifics about what it is that you want and why you want it. And when the league just says no, don't take it as a no and turn around and walk out. We're all big boys here or grown-ups, and no isn't always no when you're negotiating. And so rather, when the league just says no, say, okay, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Or what exactly is it you're saying no to? And just kind of get that out of them. If it's insurance or, things like that. Maybe the league doesn't want to cover all the insurance. but the players don't want to cover all of it either. Can we meet in the middle somewhere? You know, surely the hockey league has some purchasing power and can get a reduced rate on insurance. If the league would go negotiate that with an insurance company, it would make it easier for the players to cover their own things like that. So I think both those points that you guys make, it basically just boils down to they would not communicate with one another. It was just so much easier to look across the table and say no, push your chair back and walk out of the room. And so I think the players, they've got to understand that their property, whether they like it or not, their property, they're an asset. And so they don't get to call all the shots, but they absolutely can be more reasonable and make their point instead of just getting upset and walking off.
Yeah, you made some really good points on both sides, and that's actually the other half of that question is there anything else you would do if you're on the NHL side, not the player side, but NHL? Is there any other way that you think you'd compromise with the players? And I think for me, a lot of times I think education helps out a lot as far as, you know, maybe not getting into the specific weeds of all the financials, but putting stuff out there in layman's terms to say, hey, these are our costs. This is what it takes to run this business. And specifically with the revenue that's coming in because of the attendance, it's this. Then we have to pay our vendors. We have to pay all of our, you know, people and the players, and just kind of spell it out that way to say, hey, you know, the margin there is not, you know, a huge amount. And again, you got to be careful with talking financials with players, because, you know, if it is out of whack, then, you know, obviously the players are going to want more money. But if it's close, sometimes that education says, hey, you know what, if you guys bring in more, if you win more, you bring in more people, then we can pay you more. But, you know, right now, you know, you guys aren't playing very well, and kind of throw it back at them saying, we got to start winning. You guys start winning a certain amount, and we start bringing in the people, then, you know, then we can kind of negotiate. But right now, you guys aren't playing well, or, you know, whatever the case is, and kind of put it back on them to say, here's where it's at. Here's realistically where it's at. Here's the margins. We don't have a ton of money that we can pay every single player. And you got to be careful with that, because, you know, obviously different players make different salaries, and you don't want to have that.
Yeah.
But,
right.
You know, sometimes I think that helps on the NHL side of how they can communicate or help that situation.
Yeah. That to me was one of the reasons, you know, you do have that, and you've got, you know, they talked about the franchises that bring in more money and the ones that don't and stuff like that. That's, you know, we see that in every sport. I root for the Raiders and I root for the A's. They're both right there in Oakland, and Oakland is a low money franchise. They don't have that. But yet they've got World Series, they've got Super Bowl trophies. I mean, they find a way to get it done. They've got incredibly loyal, crazy fans. It's just one of those things.
The Raiders, though, really, dude?
That's my husband's team.
Yeah.
You know,
I have a jersey. I have a fall jersey.
Carr went to Fresno State. I'm just saying that's where I'm from, so just throw that out there.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
Oh, it's my team too.
The way that
is it really nice?
The way that I look at it, like last year, I don't remember who was in the Super Bowl. I don't really care. I didn't understand why they bothered having a Super Bowl if the Raiders weren't going. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Nice.
But anyways, it's one of those things where, there's plenty of examples of lower income franchises making it. They can do it. And that really boils down to what the owners are willing to do. You might look at a guy and he's upset because he's not getting paid what so-and-so is getting paid. Well, you didn't negotiate very well, dude. That's on you.
Yeah.
And that's, if you're upset, call your agent, let him know he sucks and that you want a better deal. And so that's where I think the union really kind of gets in the way. If the owners were more interested or supportive of the players, the owners should be plenty of representation for the players, but it doesn't turn out that way. So, because they want to make their money too. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's very true. It's round and round.
Right.
If we don't have anything else on the negotiations on each side, the last question on here is the gospel question. And if there's any concepts that are pertinent in this case, what do you think? Or if there's any concepts from the past week's readings that pertain to this case, if so, what are they? If you got anything.
I know around the beginning of the year, it's always kind of fun to be in ward council. Your bishopric walks in there and they're all excited about their new missionary goal that they came up with. And, they'll pitch it at the ward council and not that they're not inspired, but it's one of those things where, it's not that you really have to negotiate. You just got to look at the reality of it. I remember on my mission, me and my companion setting these outrageous goals, and then you don't get crud at the end of the week. So you're basically setting yourself up for disappointment. So I think there are times when in church where, once again, not to call it negotiating, but we counsel together about everything. And we do that so that there's a consensus. I heard President Eyring share an experience one time of the council, the 12 meeting, and there was something that was pretty important, but they weren't all together on it, and so they tabled it until the next meeting. And he remembered his back was to the group, so he didn't see who it was. But one of the 12 walked past the prophet on his way out of the room and said, "Thank you for giving us a chance to think about this more. I just wasn't really sure how I felt about it yet." And so, and it was an important thing. The things that we try and do at church, they're all important. Nobody's really got a responsibility that's more important than anybody else's. And so we do counsel together, and we do try and consider what one another have to deal with. And in reality, what we want to do is be supportive, as opposed to I don't want to get my agenda across. I want to do something that helps everybody else succeed as well.
Mm-hmm. I think I like all those things that you said. I think for me, as you were talking, it made me think about, when I was scoutmaster at my last troop, and negotiating with those scouts sometimes was very difficult. You're just like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be here all day if you guys don't figure this thing out. And I would go back and forth and kind of negotiate with them, and it would help me a little bit with the negotiation. But as far as like with negotiating, within church or scripture and stuff like that, I don't necessarily think that there's not really a negotiation with Heavenly Father per se. I mean, we got pretty much everything like dialed in on what we're supposed to do. There's different roads that we could take and different paths that we can go, but we kind of have, like word of wisdom, we know there's certain standards that we're supposed to uphold, so there's no negotiation there, but there's a little bit of negotiation maybe within the inner workings of the church, as you mentioned. So those are some good points. What do you got, Sydney?
I have nothing. I hate this question every week because I'm like, my brain is just so fried by the time we get to this that I just like, how am I supposed to come up with something? I have 5 other classes and I just don't understand. Trying to find an internship, planning next semester. I'm related to school, but that's about it. And we've already done that.
There you go. Are you doing the internship right now?
Next semester. So
see, then there you go. That you answer the question. You're negotiating with BYU on what you should be doing. Boom, done.
It's horrible. I'm like, why can't I count what I'm already doing as an? They're ridiculous. Their requirements and everything are just so outrageous. It really makes me mad sometimes.
Mine's changed. I'm going to end the broadcast right now. So I'm going to